How many people here have a basic familiarity with the history of the Chinese Revolution? If you raise a hand, sir. All right. Some people, yeah. Yeah, I know I didn't know so much not so long ago. I found often people will know the basic buzzwords like guerrilla warfare, Long March, the base areas. But I think even many people on the left who do know quite a bit still lack a lot of clarity about this historical sequence, and so draw lessons from it that are entirely incorrect. Some sort of more extreme examples on the left are, on the one hand, so-called Maoist third worldists. The lesson that these people draw from the Chinese Revolution is that under imperialism, the only place where revolution can occur is among oppressed nations, because even though there are oppressed and exploited masses in an imperialist country, they also benefit from imperialism, and so somehow they're inherently reactionary. And then on the other hand, there are many so-called Marxists who claim that the revolution in China wasn't a Marxist revolution at all because of its focus on the countryside and peasants. They say that Maoism diluted proletarian politics by bringing it to the countryside. They often parrot bourgeois propaganda about the Chinese Revolution and use some poor understanding of Marxist or Trotsky's stagism to say it wasn't the right stage yet. I think if you look closely at these two claims, they are both also counter-revolutionary in essence. They either negate the possibility for revolution today in an imperialist country, or for a revolution to have taken place in China. Maybe they shouldn't have launched a revolution, or nothing happened at all. I really see these as two sides of the same coin. So instead, I want to argue that not only are there valuable lessons to be learned from the Chinese Revolution, but that we can apply these lessons to the task of organizing for revolution here in the United States, which is not to say that we should blindly copy the revolutionary strategies and tactics adopted by the Chinese. On the contrary, we will see that the situation in China was quite different from the situation in the United States today. But as was mentioned in the first talk, just because there are differences doesn't mean that there are no universal lessons. And also, as was said in the first talk, if we don't draw these universal lessons, we're bound to repeat the same mistakes. So in this talk, I will discuss a historical sequence from China from 1927 to 1949, and along the way, we'll point out some of the major political decisions that allowed this historical sequence to end in a major victory, the establishment of the People's Republic of China. And then I will describe another situation in India today, where revolutionaries face an objective situation that is similar and different from that faced by Chinese revolutionaries, and how they learned lessons from the Chinese experience to inform their work. When Mao wrote, "Why is it that red political power can exist in China?" in 1928, China was a semi-colonial, semi-feudal, and semi-capitalist nation. So I think we should draw out what all of those things mean, because it's not instantly clear to a lot of people. On the one hand, it was semi-colonial, because it was dominated by the rule of British, French, Japanese, and US imperialist powers. These powers were closely allied with different factions of warlords and state forces throughout the country. But because these factions were almost constantly warring with each other, as is an inevitable part of inter-imperialist conflict, there wasn't the basis for a unified and powerful colonial state to arise. So instead it was very scattered and disunited. It was also both a semi-feudal and a semi-capitalist nation, and this has to do with the nature of imperialism, which oppresses the national bourgeoisie of a country and prevents whole-scale capitalist development. Instead, the imperialist forces in China had forged alliances with bureaucrat capitalists in the cities that were loyal to them and their interests. We call these the comprador bourgeoisie, because they are interested in the interests of foreign capital above the interests of China as a whole. Of course, the bourgeoisie is never interested in the interests of the nation as a whole, but we can still make a distinction here between capitalist development within one nation and serving foreign capital. This economic relation also saw no benefit in developing the economy in the countryside, and so instead tended to extract surplus value from it as a whole. So as a result, the Chinese who lived in the countryside, which was the vast majority of the country, 400 out of 500 million people, were still dominated by the rule of landlords and old feudal customs. There was also a small urban proletariat that had begun to appear in the early 20th century. Unlike the peasantry, which is exploited by a tenant relation with landlords, but often owns their own land and some productive implements, the proletariat has no property and is exploited through waged labor, and has no access to the means of production. We should appreciate differences here. These objective conditions contrast sharply with those that revolutionaries face in the US, which is a highly developed capitalist and imperialist country, and we also have here, as an integral part of the state machine, white supremacy. So in the past, the peasantry in China had the potential to be quite revolutionary and participated in numerous revolutionary struggles, but all of them had failed for various reasons. For example, in 1851, there was the Taiping Rebellion that had attempted to overthrow the imperialist control of China and establish national autonomy. However, this struggle lacked proletarian leadership. There was really no proletariat at that point in China. And so the spontaneous tendencies of the peasantry towards individualism and localism could not be checked. The peasants also lacked a concrete idea of what revolutionary transformation would look like. The major idea put forward by the Taiping rebels was this idea of land reform, where they would give everyone the same amount of land to be worked on individually, achieving equality between the peasants of plot size. Although this had some correct ideas in it, this plan provided no basis for collectivization, and without collectivization, there was no way to develop the economic forces in China. So this displays a feudal ideology, which includes a different relationship to patriarchy, and also a nihilism, this idea that things have been this way for thousands of years and they can never change. So the individual household is the best we can get. All this does is reproduces solutions, the old social formations, in a more just way. And then in 1911, Sun Yat-sen and the Chinese Nationalist Party, who represented China's small bourgeois class, led a revolution that was able to overthrow the Qing dynasty. However, because the progressive forces in the bourgeoisie didn't formulate a real strategy for eliminating imperialist and feudal elements from China, this revolution also failed in its goal of liberating the peasants from the entwined forces of feudalism and imperialist oppression. And ultimately, this is because it wasn't in the interests of the bourgeoisie to do this, because they're capitalists. So it was seen through these different struggles that revolution could not be achieved through the leadership of either the bourgeoisie or the undirected resistance of the peasantry. But the founding of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, in 1921 marked the real possibility for a proletarian political organization that could overcome these tendencies. The founders themselves, as was mentioned in the first talk, were inspired by the October Revolution in 1917, which demonstrated that a revolution could succeed in a relatively backwards imperialist country, albeit one with a very large population of peasants. And we should be square, Lenin and the Bolsheviks would not have succeeded without the alliance they developed between the workers and peasants, and it was this alliance that would form the basis for the Chinese Revolution as well. Mao and the CCP called themselves Marxist-Leninists, so they saw the necessity for the proletariat to exercise leadership in the revolution, but that doesn't mean that mass work needs to be dominantly among the proletariat, and there's always a need to be flexible in finding the best ways to apply this leadership. However, the CCP would have to grapple with the uniqueness of China's situation as well. Because of the capitalist and foreign imperialist forces had a lot of power in the cities, it was much harder to sustain revolutionary development and organization there, whereas in the rural areas, these forces had little to no armed power, except for some local government structures that were quite weak. Mao himself played a leading role in the process the CCP went through of analyzing the objective situation. Because of his correct analysis, he grasped the importance of the countryside for a successful revolution in China. And he didn't do this by sitting around in a university somewhere. Mao was a part of the CCP's mass work, for example, in Hunan, where they had inspired a movement of peasant associations which united the poor and middle peasants in revolutionary struggle. These associations overthrew the corrupt local governments and established their own political structures for the purposes of self-government. This struggle was aimed not just at resisting the oppression of the landlord class and the feudal relations, but actually at creating the conditions to overthrow them and transform society. And Mao wrote a really important piece on this called Report on an Investigation of the Peasant Movement in Hunan in 1927. Because of the divided nature of the state forces, the peasants were not only able to take power, but also able to repulse attacks from armies that were seeking to restore landlords. This meant that these areas could later on become base areas where the revolutionary armed forces could live and be supplied from. They could also launch guerrilla attacks from these bases and later could use them to supply their armies in strategic warfare. So in the present situation in the US, many claim that the primary political task is just to resist oppression in one form or another. For example, the oppressive deportations of immigrants. And of course we should resist oppression, but this approach, if we just focus on that, can never actually liberate the masses from their chains because it doesn't get at the root of the social structures that cause their oppression. On the other hand, a revolutionary approach to oppression requires a political organization that can sustain the advances made by the masses in their struggles against resistance, and that can also synthesize key lessons to learn from their mistakes. Just so to sum up where we've been so far, it's important that revolutionaries grasp the objective situation and seek to apply proletarian leadership to develop revolutionary power in it in the best way based on that situation. And for this, they also need a political organization, as was mentioned in the first talk. Otherwise, the advances made in the mass struggles cannot be sustained. So another important thing to talk about is that this organization will need to make alliances with all sorts of different forces in order to achieve a revolution. But these need to be handled correctly in order to avoid surrendering initiative to the forces of reaction. So we'll talk a little bit now about what that meant for the CCP. So there were many party members in 1927 and 28 who argued that the communists should surrender leadership to the national bourgeois forces in China, which was the Chinese Nationalist Party or the Kuomintang. And as we talked about before, the Nationalists could sometimes be very progressive in nature, like in 1911. However, by the 1920s, the left wing of the party came into conflict with a strong right wing. And with the death of Sun Yat-sen, this right wing became stronger and stronger. These rightists were strongly opposed to the communists, and it increasingly became clear that they represented the interests not of Chinese nationalist liberation, but of foreign imperialist powers. They began to suppress the trade unions and anti-imperialist demonstrators in the cities where they held power, which displayed a deep distrust of the masses and their aspirations. And they persistently opposed the peasant associations. They accused them of disturbing the rear and of driving away the rich and their lucrative taxes. Because of the influence of the party members who said that they needed to accept the leadership of the nationalists, the CCP made a set of poor decisions in which they tried to cooperate with the rightists. This led to the Shanghai Massacre in 1927, when Chiang Kai-shek declared martial law and murdered all of the communists in the area that his forces could find, and also purged a lot of the progressive members in the Nationalist Party. This was a major setback for the revolution. But it's important to note that because of those who had correctly grasped the need for independent organization, and particularly organization in the countryside where the state forces had little power, this was just a major setback instead of a decisive defeat. So on the one hand, it was a very unique situation in China where their national liberation struggle against imperialism opened up the possibility to unite with a lot of forces who shared this common interest, unlike in an imperialist country like the US. But nonetheless, there is an important lesson we can learn here that is universal. It is necessary to avoid surrendering initiative to the forces of reaction, even if these forces do seem to be relatively progressive in a given situation. This is a major dividing line on the left today, and there are many so-called socialist or Marxist groups who disagree with this. For example, you can look at those who channeled all their energies into supporting the Sanders campaign, even though he is a pro-imperialist bourgeois reformist at heart. So a stage in the Chinese Revolution where it made much more sense to have a closer tactical alliance with the nationalists was in 1937, when the Japanese army invaded China in an attempt to turn it into a part of their greater Asian co-prosperity sphere. Japan was an imperialist country. It was also a fascist country. And we can see this through the actions they carried out in their occupation of China. They pursued a policy of the 3 alls: kill all, burn all, loot all, and also implicitly rape all. They bombed cities with chemical weapons, and they also pursued gruesome scientific experiments using peasants as guinea pigs. Although they were dominantly interested in expanding their imperialist control over China to increase the profits of their capitalist class, they were also quite explicit about seeing their invasion as an intervention to crush communism. So given this brutal reality, it made sense to call a truce with the nationalists, who they've been fighting with for the past 10 years, to deal with a common enemy. But this time, Mao was able to resist pressure from those within and outside the party who wished to, once again, subordinate the CCP to the nationalists. One place where this pressure came from was Stalin and the Comintern, who urged them to merge the Red Army with the Nationalist Army because they thought this would prevent the USSR from having to open up a second front with Japan. But they were quite mistaken about this, actually. The nationalists themselves could be quite lackluster about opposing the Japanese. And this is because, although they would prefer not to have to live under Japanese occupation, they did share some common interests, representing the interests of foreign imperialist powers and opposing communism. So even in this anti-fascist war, the CCP needed to adopt a role of proletarian leadership. So many today say that the election of Trump is equivalent to fascism, but we should not equate Trump's America to an outright fascist regime like what the Chinese faced under Japanese occupation. It's true that Trump has emboldened police departments and ICE agents who do often display a fascist logic in their daily practices, but this does not mean that the U.S. is dominantly a fascist state in the way that the Japanese state was in this time period. And despite all that, even if the U.S. was a fascist state, we see from the example of Mao and the Chinese communists that it still would not make sense to surrender leadership to the bourgeois capitalist forces, like those who are leading the so-called resistance today. Throughout this struggle, the communists were heavily outnumbered and outgunned by both the nationalists and the Japanese. And so some CCP cadre said that because of this relative weakness, they should do what Stalin on the Comintern said and subordinate themselves to the nationalists. But Mao and others saw that they needed to break from this logic, because in practice, what that would have meant was surrendering the possibility of revolution altogether. Also, you can see these cadres could only see certain quantitative aspects of a revolutionary army, like gunpowder and manpower, rather than the qualitative political forces that the Red Army represented. Because it could draw from and channel the resistance of the vast majority of the Chinese people who faced the heaviest oppression from the fascists. And being able to channel this resistance also would have been impossible if they'd confined their work to the cities, because the Japanese had strong power there. Also, the decision of the CCP to not surrender initiative to the nationalists enabled them to avoid destruction after the anti-fascist war. So after the war ended in 1945, there was a brief one-year truce, but by 1946, the nationalists, funded by American imperialists, turned on their former allies, and another war began. But once more, the CCP was able to utilize the vast forces they had built up throughout the past 20 years of warfare to win a decisive victory against Chiang Kai-shek. So by grappling with the objective situations, engaging in deep work among the Chinese masses, and correctly handling alliances without surrendering initiative, the communists were able to establish a revolutionary government called the People's Republic of China in 1949. This victory did not mean that the task of revolution was completed. On the contrary, socialism and the building of communism requires the initiative of the productive masses to ward off the forces of reaction, both inside and outside of China, and to continue the task of transforming society to eliminate the possibility of oppression by drawing more and more members of the masses into politics. And this task of eliminating the possibility of oppression requires the establishment of communism, which is only possible, really, once the entire world has been transformed in this way. So in one sense, the Maoists were defeated in the end because they didn't accomplish communism, but that doesn't mean that they failed entirely. And we can see that internal to each phase of the revolution, there were successes and failures. So one example of a really big success was the experience of the Cultural Revolution later on in 1966 to 76, which demonstrated the need for mass participation in rebellion as part of the transition to communism. In the end, of course, the Cultural Revolution was defeated in 1976 by forces who wanted to restore capitalism in China, counter-revolutionary rightists led by Hua Guofeng and Deng Xiaoping. And these forces brutally crushed the revolutionary forces that were in China. Estimated around 10 million people were killed during that time, and the same number were arrested. But there's not a lot of time today to go into the history from 49 to 76. There was quite a lot more that happened there that's worth talking about. But we do see from these little examples that just because the Maoists lost doesn't mean that they were wrong, as was mentioned in the first talk. I think that this kind of analysis stems from an approach that sees politics as finding the right answers to certain questions, like on a test or something. On the contrary, though, it is entirely possible for revolutionaries to have a correct political approach and still lose because of an imbalance of political forces. And then on the other hand, for revolutionaries to have a lot of aspects that are very positive and correct, but have a few negative aspects that become secondary, as was talked about before. So since this coup, the world has witnessed a period of overall political reaction. The forces of capital have consolidated and expanded their power, while their lackeys in the academy and the ideological sphere have gone to great efforts to convince us that there is no alternative to capitalist imperialism, and that the best we can do is work within the system. Despite these efforts, Maoist politics has retained its relevance for revolutionaries into the 21st century. There have been Maoist people's wars in the Philippines, Nepal, and Peru, but by far the most advanced of these efforts has been in India. So we're going to talk briefly about that. By tracing the development of the revolutionary struggle there, we can see that the Maoists in India faced questions not so different from the ones the CCP faced in the 20s and 30s, and they have drawn lessons from the CCP that have allowed them to make major advances. And to bring up these questions again, they are, what is the objective situation at present? And given the situation, what sort of political organization is required to realize the revolutionary potential of the masses? In the 1960s, there was a split in the Communist Party of India over the way forward for revolution. Some advocated confining their work to legislative campaigns and trade unions under President Nehru at the time, or Prime Minister Nehru. Others, like for example Charu Majumdar, said that the primary thing they should be doing is fusing with the masses in their struggles for agrarian revolution, while still engaging with legal work secondarily. Given the reactionary and semi-feudal nature of the Indian state, the form that a legal revolutionary struggle there needed to take there was also a people's war in the countryside. And throughout the development of the Communist Party of India and the various splits and mergers that have occurred since the 1960s, this approach to revolutionary struggle has been continued through the work of what is now the CPI Maoist. The Maoists there now have activity in large swaths of the countryside, and within those there are several base areas where the Indian state has little to no control. They have met, however, with increasingly brutal repression from the reactionary Indian government, as in Operation Green Hunt, which started in 2009 and is still underway. And they've also received significant attention from the U.S. state. There have been joint military exercises with the Indian military and a sharing of tactics, especially those used in Afghanistan. The fact that the Maoists have reached the point where they are considered a major threat demonstrates that they've made major advances. This was due to their correct analysis of the situation in India. Unlike the other Indian Marxist groups, the CPI Maoists correctly realized that, despite claiming to be the world's largest democracy, the Indian state represents the interests of their comprador bourgeois ruling class, and so represents the interests of foreign imperialism instead of the aspirations of the productive masses. India is also a semi-feudal country, and the peasants in the countryside still desire agrarian revolution that was promised to them in 1946 but was never received. But India is also a semi-capitalist country, and the cities are dominated by the rule of a bureaucrat capitalist ruling class that represents the forces of imperialism. There is a few key differences with China. For example, India has a more centralized neo-colonial state government, but there are many parts of the country where the Indian state has very little control. One area where the Indian state has almost no control over the situation is the Adivasi and the tribal peoples in their homelands. The Maoists have had great success organizing there. These people make up 8.6% of the Indian population. In these areas, there's very little infrastructure. The Indian state does support some development projects in their homelands, but these cause large amounts of environmental damage and displace the people. And when the Adivasis try to protest against these developments, the capital state has responded with repression from violent and brutal police forces. This is because the Indian state views the lives of the Adivasis as disposable, much like the U.S. state views many non-white people here today. And the Maoists went to efforts to fuse with the Adivasis, to engage in their struggles, and have been engaged for quite a long time in mass work among them. On the one hand, to educate them, increase their literacy, help increase their economic development, because there are real objective difficulties because of their mode of existence. But they primarily also are trying to develop their ability for political struggle, because ultimately the Indian state does not see the continued existence of the Adivasi people as a part of their plan. And so they see this political struggle for them to achieve liberation as primary. And there's similar work being done among the rural peasants, trying to build up red power in different ways and carry out agrarian revolution. There have been efforts to engage with the progressive and revolutionary organizations among the Mass Proletariat and the petty bourgeoisie. And so all these things would have been possible if they had confined their work within the Indian state. So like the Chinese, the Maoists and their allies have dared to struggle against the forces of reaction, but they've also dared to win by developing a mass revolutionary politics that can break all the chains of oppression and exploitation. This means struggling against the chains of patriarchy, of the oppressive caste system, the chains of national oppression, the chains of oppressive feudal relations, and even the chains of undeveloped productive forces, for example, among the Adivasis. This process has now built to the point where there's a major possibility that this people's war could come to overthrow the Indian government entirely in the next decade. So let this example serve as a transition into the next talk, which aims to show more broadly how the historical experiences laid out above still retain their relevance today, but in the example of the U.S.